integrating cover crops is really valuable. We know that from the research that's been done, but it's costly. And so integrating livestock gives a farmer an immediate return on that investment. Whether they're harvesting it as a forage or they're grazing it, there's a return on that investment in that cover crop. And so it makes it a little bit easier to take on that challenge.
Welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show. I'm your host, Leo Bastos, Assistant Professor in Integrative Precision Agriculture at the University of Georgia. Today, we welcome our guest, Dr. Miranda Meehan. She is an Associate Professor and Extension Livestock Environmental Stewardship Specialist at North Dakota State University. Miranda, welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show. It's great to have you here today. And to start things off, I would like to ask if you could share with us and our audience about your background, where you've been, where you are today, and some of the projects you're involved.
Yeah, so not very exciting. I've lived in North Dakota most of my life, grew up on a very small farm ranch, had livestock involved in forage, and that's how I ended up where I'm at now. I got involved in range judging when I was 13, and so that made me pursue a career in range sciences and that focus on grazing systems and grazing system management. When I finished my PhD, I was an environmental consultant for 4 years in Western North Dakota doing pre-construction surveys for energy development-related projects. I started here at NDSU in 2015, and my research is pretty broad. I have research related to reclamation, integrated crop livestock systems, grazing management within riparian systems and riparian ecology. And we're starting to do some work in both extensive rangelands and crop systems using virtual fence to manage grazing livestock in those systems.
Nice. That's very exciting. And we've had guests that some people been all over the world until they got to their position. Some people started and continue in the same state or same geography. And really, it's all. I guess every situation brings its own benefits, and pros and cons of everything in life. But it's really awesome to see, your work being done where you grew up, and you can really see those connections from what you do today with what you learned since when you were growing up around that topic. So it's very exciting as well to be able to make those connections. A very, very valuable setting. All right, so so you have a broad range of projects that going all the way from more focus on the livestock side, and also some projects where you overlap more the crop and livestock production systems. So I really I want to start us off with asking your thoughts on if a grower is thinking of perhaps in integrating crop and livestock into their system, what are some of the benefits that maybe overall a grower can have by integrating both of those, and especially some of the benefits you've seen through your research?
I think the immediate one is, so we have those soil health related benefits that can take some time, right? And integrating cover crops is really valuable. We know that from the research that's been done, but it's costly. And so integrating livestock gives a farmer an immediate return on that investment. Whether they're harvesting it as a forage or they're grazing it, there's a return on that investment in that cover crop. And so it makes it a little bit easier to take on that challenge. Other benefits, the soil health benefits, which in our area take a long time. So our work's being done in a semi-arid environment, and 5 years minimum before we start seeing those soil health benefits, even with livestock integration, livestock should speed up the process because they help facilitate and speed up the breakdown of that organic matter and carbon into the system and make it into a more plant available form. But we don't, there's not a lot of research that's been done that captures that yet because of how research is funded and how long these changes take to be visible or statistically significant.
Absolutely. So, a really important point that you're making here is that faster return on investment from just adopting cover crops, right? So, if you have a row crop producer that is maybe thinking of cover crops, already has cover crops, but doesn't have the livestock component there, by doing that integration, they do see that benefit a little bit faster. So that's a very important one. And so, especially, talking from the or speaking from the crop side of things, how does that integration, perhaps if we think of more on the cash crop side of things, going beyond the cover crop side of things, how does integrating livestock into the system can also, help or maybe change things as far as, nutrient management or weed management or different components that a row crop system by itself may not have all those interactions when you bring that livestock component?
Yeah, I think it depends on your system. There's so many there's so many ways we can go here. Um, Most people start when they're integrating cover crops with rye or a winter cereal, just because that's the easiest thing to fit into a system in terms that you're not giving up your cash crop in any way. So our work that we've done with winter rye, we've been able to graze it in both fall and spring, and then put in that cash crop, planting it into the rye. We've seen this past year we did a project where we grazed in the spring, then prior, and then we left some of our rye on grazed, and we had a no rye, and the weed control in the rye, but the grazing also didn't impact our rye production and cover. So we had the same effectiveness of having that rye cover crop, regardless of if it was grazed or not. So we got that added benefit of the forage. We did see a little, because we were droughty last spring, we did see a delay in the growth of our soybeans in that project. But by the end of the growing season, they caught up because of the moisture retention under that cover crop and reducing that evapotranspiration. And so we did see a benefit in the long run that we were able to maintain and get the same amount of yields, but still get an extra because we had that forage. And we had 21 days of extra grazing, which is really important up in the northern Great Plains, where we're always looking for extra grazing because of our short growing season.
Absolutely. It's a great point there as far as these trade-offs, right? So we have a limited amount of sunlight or heat, and how can we best make use of that with this constrained time, using different crops and integrating different components. So that's a really, really interesting point. So I wanted to follow that up looking on the flip side of that coin. So for growers that are implementing integrated crop livestock systems, what are some of the challenges that you've seen on the ground, and perhaps like how are people dealing with those and trying to mitigate those challenges?
I think the biggest challenge that I hear from every farmer rancher we work with is infrastructure. So fencing and water. And when we are looking at managing and grazing those cover crops, we know we can increase harvest efficiency, reducing waste if we strip graze the cover crops. So basically rotationally grazing them. However, we have a hesitance to adapt that practice because of the extra labor involved with putting up those strips and moving those, and knowing we're going to have to take those fences down at the end of the grazing period so that we can manage that field, which is part of the reason of our virtual fence research, is looking at how can we address some of those challenges. But those are the two biggest challenges I hear when I'm working with folks.
Awesome. Well, it's definitely something very important to consider when trying to incorporate those. And especially since that's part of the research program, what have been some of the findings that you're seeing as far as using the sorry if I missed the term, but did you say virtual fencing? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So what can you tell us a little bit about that and how it works? What type of perhaps connectivity infrastructure is required, and what are some of the savings you're seeing on your studies?
So very early in this research, we only have 1 year. But virtual fence, I like to, the simplest way to put it is like the dog collars for cows or grazing animals. And so the cows, we put a collar on our cows that are grazing that gives them first an audio cue. And then if they don't obey the audio cue, then they get an electrical cue. So similar to an electric fence, but without the fence being there. And so it's managed through a web-based platform. There's a few different companies out there, depending on the company and product you're working with. Some of them require you to have a radio tower that then communicates from the web-based platform, satellite, the cloud, to the collar and gets the data back and forth between the collar and the tower and then back to you. Some of them use cellular only, which in our environment is a challenge because we don't have great cell cover across the entire state. And so that is one of our challenges. But in terms of labor and the effectiveness of the fence, we found it the effectiveness was the same as having a physical fence there. So we have over 90% efficacy of having that virtual fence versus a one-strand electric fence that what we would use, which cows tend to break through that once in a while too. But without it's easier for them to get back in with a virtual fence versus an electric fence. So we're really optimistic about that labor savings potentially. Challenges, obviously, learning a new technology and that upfront cost of adapting that technology.
Awesome. And I know you said this is very preliminary data, but have you seen that, or are these companies reporting any numbers related to, like a comparison in cost, especially when you have the regular fence and the virtual fence, like how many, I don't know, maybe how many collars or how much area, what type of systems would you expect to see a break even between both of them, and then after that point, the virtual fence being more economically viable?
So that type of research is being conducted right now. I know there is a project with more traditional grazing systems that should be published in the next year, and that's some of the data we're collecting in our project as well. But with year one, we haven't really gotten into analyzing any of that data yet.
No, that's I think it's when we are at the forefront of what's coming to the market and being developed, it's really exciting to try these out. And even if we don't have that I guess money answer yet, but it's something that we'll develop in time as well. So one thing that also comes to mind here is, so especially in North Dakota and the systems that you have being semi-arid, growing crops could be already a challenge just because of water availability, water consumption by the crops. So when you're bringing in livestock into that cropping system, or maybe you're bringing a row crop system into a livestock production system as well, what have you seen as far as, especially around water and water availability? How is that competition between using water, just going from a cash crop or partitioning that between a cash crop into a cover crop as well, and now bringing livestock into the picture as well? Water is that resource that perhaps is one of the most limiting. So what have you seen as how are growers managing water, especially when they're making these integrations?
I think the biggest concern we see with the water is, that termination timing, if we're doing a winter cereal that we're planting into, so that we're not using up too much water before that we're trying to get that crop established, which is part of what we ran into this past year, but we actually seen that the residue and coverage offset that. And then the other side is sometimes we have people that give up their planting a traditional crop, or maybe their crop failed. So in 2021, we had a statewide drought. It was one of the more severe droughts we've had in history, comparable to the 30s and the 80s here, which were both very bad. And so we had people that had failed crops, but we started getting rain in late July. And so people were able to capitalize on that and put in a warm season cover crop that they could harvest for forage, and then offset some of the challenges they were having. Because at that point in time, as a livestock producer, you're either selling cows or you're paying a lot of money to bring forage in from another state. And so that was able to offset some of those expenses for those producers that were going through that. We had a project working with 5 producers across the state with a season-long cover crop planted for that project. And the increased flexibility that they were able to take animals off of their range and pasture land and graze that cover crop in the fall a little earlier, reducing the stress and allowing those other grazing resources to recover. And so it really just increased the overall climate resilience of their operation and being able to more quickly recover after that drought in comparison to others.
Yeah, that's a very interesting case. Thanks for sharing that. So I, working in row crop precision agriculture, and I specifically work in nutrient management. I had this curiosity of how are growers managing this added, perhaps spatial variability of nutrient inputs through the livestock? How are they managing their cash crop after that, and just having the different spatial distribution of organic inputs into the system and the variability that creates for the crop afterwards? What is being done in that area?
That's a great question, and I think that's all over the place depending on the producer's approach. Ideally, we're soil testing and making adjustments based off of those soil tests. I think once research gets further along, maybe we can have a credit similar to what we have when we're thinking about a no-till system and adapting no-till, but the data is not there yet. And so I think a lot of people, it's soil testing and using the best available data. The problem is that with manure especially, we have a slower release. And so we've seen this with our project with the season-long cover crop. We came in we grazed it that fall and came in with a cash crop of corn. We looked at our soil data that spring. We didn't see any differences between our treatments, regardless of grazing intensity or no grazing. But we've seen differences in yield at the end of the year. And we didn't add additional fertility just to reduce variability and factors within our project. So we know something's going on there, and I think it had to do with that slow release of that manure and the timing of our sampling. And so that is definitely something we need to learn more about in our field so that we can make more informed decisions. The other piece in our projects too is that strip grazing. If we can increase the stock density of those animals, so number of animals per unit area, then we can even out that distribution. And so that's some of the research we're looking at, is how can we improve that distribution of those nutrients across the field so it isn't quite as spotty.
Oh, that's really interesting. And when you say that there was a difference, so there was no difference in nutrients in the soil when you soil tested, but you saw effects on yield at the end. What were those yield effects? Like, what was higher, what was lower?
We had a cover crop with no grazing, and then we had what we call a 50% utilization, so 50% of the biomass out there. We had the animals harvest through grazing, and then 75%, which is most all of it that they could physically graze without impacting their performance negatively. And we've seen a trend where the higher the grazing use, and then on those grazing treatments, the grazing treatments had significantly higher yield and biomass than the non-grazed. And then as the higher stock density it had a trend being higher than the 50%. So not significantly, but it was still trending higher.
All right. So I do want to follow up and ask, from your experience in extension, working with growers on the ground, what have been some success cases that you could perhaps tell us about, and not only telling about the story, but also what made them successful when making this, when working with crop livestock production systems?
Yeah, I think I almost gain more from those relationships than the growers do sometimes, in terms of I've gotten most of my research ideas come from questions I keep getting that I don't have the answer for. So I've definitely gained a lot from the growers that I get to work with. Um, I think that the biggest impact was probably during the drought and that flexibility, those producers that had that cover crop available to graze and how they didn't have to sell as many animals because they had that greater flexibility in the system. I think that was probably one of the biggest impacts that I've witnessed firsthand.
It's time for our famous three.
So we're getting towards the part of our episode where we ask our guests the three final questions. So these questions are more about some resources that you may have to share and that you would like to share with our audience. So the first one that I have for you is what is your favorite technical resource? That could be a book, it could be a movie, or really anything else, more on the technical side that you've come across and that you think would be a good one to share with others as well.
Honestly, which is it's not quite technical, but I think just being the ability to engage with and follow other researchers on Twitter, and I'm more aware of what's coming out in terms of publications, and so that's been really useful. And I do also get to engage with a lot of farmers there as well. I think it keeps me more current than I probably would otherwise be.
Absolutely. And this is something, I know at least here in the US, Twitter is a really important platform, or maybe X, I guess.
Yes, I was thinking that after I said it.
Yeah, I always forget that they changed name. But it's a really important platform where researchers and especially growers, I mean, there's a lot of grower involvement on Twitter, right? And I don't know how often that happens in other countries, but I know that our audience spans different countries. So just to give more context as well, Twitter is a really great resource for those connections, both with researchers and especially growers. They are really there watching and commenting and spreading the word as well. Yeah, awesome. All right, so my next question for you is similar but different, right? So what would be your favorite resource, but outside of your technical expertise that you could share with us?
Yeah. The thing I think I valued most is some of the professional development books I've read. So, emotional intelligence, crucial conversations. I think I've grown personally a lot from them, but it's also improved my ability to engage with others, and um, especially when we're in a going through a challenging time, and being able to talk through a stressful event with a producer, and I'm stressed and they're stressed, and so how can we come to that common ground and find a solution?
Absolutely. So you mentioned a couple of names there. Were those like the names of the books themselves?
So the emotional intelligence, I think it's probably version 2 of the book. And then crucial conversations is as well as a title, and there's a training that goes with that as well.
Awesome. I read emotional intelligence. I was not aware of crucial conversations. I'll definitely check that out. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. All right, so our next and last question of the three is to you and through your experience working with students, with professionals, with producers. What do you think is one skill that sets successful professionals apart from others?
I really think it's the soft skills, the emotional intelligence, the ability to remain calm during a conversation and be objective and think through the other person's point of view. And so being empathetic, and um, I think the more you get into your profession, the more you realize that even though you went into the profession to manage a resource, whether that's within cropping systems, grazing systems, natural resources, you're managing people to have that impact on those resources. And so if you can't connect with those people effectively, you're not going to have as large of impact in your career.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. And it's really interesting because across many guests, we see some of these themes reappearing, and it's really interesting to notice how emotional intelligence and a lot of the soft skills that we don't get, properly trained, I guess, in grad school at least, end up being some of the most important skills to set people apart. Yeah. Awesome. Well, Miranda, it was really, really great having you here with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your experience, your expertise. I'm sure that our audience was really going to appreciate this conversation as well. And it was really enlightening to have, someone, as you said, like you're coming from the livestock side of things and being able to be at this intersection of crop and livestock. It's really refreshing as well to hear, your thoughts on that and some of the challenges, some of the positive sides as well. So thanks so much. We appreciate having you here today.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.